50 Comanche warriors appeared at dawn, like ghosts rising from the prairie mist. They formed a perfect, silent circle around Caleb Thornfield's ranch. Their war paint a terrifying splash of crimson and black in the soft morning light. Their horses stamped the dry earth, breath pluming in the chill Texas air. Every single one of them was staring at Caleb's barn, and every single one of them wanted the girl he had hidden inside. Just 3 hours earlier, Caleb's world had been simple. It was just him, his cattle, and the ghost of a woman he'd loved. He was riding the fence line near Willow Creek, the familiar creak of saddle leather the only sound, when the gunshots echoed across the plains. This was 1876 Texas. Gunshots weren't unusual. It could be soldiers from Fort Griffin, or bandits, or even another tribal raid. It happened all the time. But these shots, these were different. They weren't the steady rhythm of a skirmish. They were frantic, desperate, the kind of sound a man makes when he knows he's about to die. Every instinct screamed at Caleb to turn his horse, to ride hard in the opposite direction. Smart ranchers didn't go looking for trouble. Smart ranchers minded their own business, because in this territory, curiosity was a death sentence. But Caleb Thornfield had buried the smart part of himself 3 years ago, right alongside his wife, Sarah. He urged his horse toward the sound, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He knew he was riding toward something terrible. He just didn't know it would change his life forever. What he found was a nightmare sketched in blood. Behind a fallen cottonwood tree, a young Comanche girl lay in a heap. An army bullet was buried deep in her shoulder, and her buckskin dress was soaked in a shade of red, so dark it was almost black. Her breathing was a shallow, painful gasp. She couldn't have been more than 16, but her eyes were ancient. They were fierce and dark, and they held no fear, only defiance. Caleb's hand went to the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. It was pure instinct, a reflex carved into his soul by grief. 3 years ago, a Comanche war party had swept through this valley. They'd burned his neighbor's farm to the ground, and they had killed Sarah. He'd found her near the well, her blue dress stained with the same dark red as the girl's now lying in front of him. The smart thing, the right thing, according to the hate that lived in his heart, was to ride away, to let nature or the bullet finish its work. The territory would be safer with one less Comanche in it, one less of the people who had stolen his world. But those eyes, they were just like Sarah's, not in color, not in shape, but in their sheer refusal to surrender, in that unbending will that said, "I am not broken." When the girl saw him, she tried to crawl away, gritting her teeth against the pain. She left a smear of blood on the dry, cracked earth. She hissed something at him in a rapid-fire language he didn't understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. "Stay back, or I will kill you, dying or not." What would you do in that moment? Would you listen to the voice of revenge, or the whisper of a memory? Let me know in the comments, because Caleb's choice split his life into two halves. The man he was before, and the man he was about to become. Caleb dismounted, slow and deliberate. He kept his hands open, away from his pistol. He could see the life draining out of her. Her breath was getting weaker, her movements more sluggish. Without help, she wouldn't last another hour. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the promise he'd made at her grave, a quiet vow whispered to the dirt that he would never let the bitterness consume what was left of his soul. He had failed that promise every single day for 3 years, until now. He moved forward and with a grunt, scooped the girl into his arms. She was shockingly light, all sharp angles and bones. She'd been running hard and starving for weeks, he could tell. She fought him at first, a weak, desperate flurry of fists against his chest. Then, as the blood loss took its toll, she went limp. The ride back to his ranch was the longest journey of his life. Every shadow seemed to hide a warrior. Every rustle in the tall grass sounded like a nocked arrow. He was carrying the daughter of his enemies, and he knew that if her people found him, they wouldn't ask questions. They would just start shooting. But he pressed on, the girl's ragged breathing, the only sound besides the thud of his horse's hooves and the frantic beating of his own heart. He didn't take her to the cabin. He couldn't. That was his and Sarah's home. He carried her to the barn instead, laying her gently on a mound of fresh hay. The bullet had to come out, now. He built a small fire, his hands shaking slightly as he heated the blade of his skinning knife until it glowed a dull orange. This was going to be crude. It was going to be agony. It would either save her life or end it. As he knelt beside her, the heat from the knife warming his face, her eyes fluttered open. They fixed on him, wide with confusion and a fresh wave of terror. She saw the glowing knife. She saw the grim set of his jaw. This white man wasn't helping her. He was going to torture her. Caleb didn't know how to explain. He just knew what he had to do. He pushed a thick leather strap into her hand. "Bite down on this," he said, his voice rough. She understood. She put the leather between her teeth, her defiant eyes never leaving his. For the next 20 minutes, the barn was filled with her muffled screams of pain. Caleb worked fast, his hands slick with her blood, digging and probing for the twisted piece of lead lodged against her bone. She trembled and convulsed, but she never passed out. She just watched him, her eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and a strange, terrifying flicker of hope. Finally, he pulled the mangled bullet free. He dropped it with a clatter, his whole body trembling with adrenaline. He packed the wound with herbs and bound it tightly with strips of a clean shirt. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. The girl's head fell back into the hay, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. And that's when Caleb heard it, a sound that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. The slow, steady beat of a war drum, far off in the distance. And it was getting closer. The drumming stopped just as the first sliver of sun crested the horizon. That's when Caleb knew. They hadn't just gotten closer, they had found him. He crept to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. His heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't a small tracking party. It was a full-blown war band. 50 mounted warriors, painted for battle. They had formed a perfect, inescapable circle around his entire property. Their leader sat on a magnificent painted stallion, straight and proud. He was an older man, his braided hair streaked with gray. Scars crisscrossed his bare chest like a map of 100 battles. He radiated an aura of absolute authority. Behind Caleb, the girl stirred in the hay. The fever was taking hold, a fire burning through her small frame. She whispered a single word in Comanche, a word that needed no translation. "Father." Caleb's blood ran cold. He wasn't just hiding a random Comanche girl. He was hiding the daughter of the war chief. The chief out front raised his hand, a silent command. The circle of riders tightened, their horses snorting, their spears glinting in the rising sun. They weren't here for cattle. They weren't here for supplies. They were here for their chief's daughter, and they had tracked her through 20 miles of hostile territory to get her back. Caleb did a quick, desperate inventory of his weapons. 1 Winchester rifle, 2 Colt pistols, maybe 30 rounds of ammunition in total. 30 rounds against 50 of the most feared warriors on the plains. He'd be lucky to last 5 minutes. But running was no longer an option. The girl was too weak to move, and even if she wasn't, they'd be ridden down before they got 100 yards. There was no escape. The chief's voice boomed across the morning air, thick with rage and grief. He spoke in broken English, each word like a hammer blow. "White man, you have what belongs to us." Caleb's mouth went dry. How could he possibly explain this? How could he make them understand that he hadn't kidnapped her? He'd saved her. That he'd risked his own neck to pull a bullet from her shoulder? To them, he was just another white settler, another thief. He thought about shouting back, trying to reason with them. But what could he say? "I found her bleeding to death." They would call him a liar. "I performed surgery on her." They would call it torture. In their world, a white man's help was just a different kind of violence. The girl, Ayana, tried to sit up, her face contorted in pain. She looked from the warriors outside to Caleb, a new, horrifying understanding dawning in her fever-bright eyes. He hadn't saved her. He had sealed both of their fates. Now they would both die here, in the dust and the hay, all because of his one foolish act of compassion. "Ayana!" the chief roared, his voice cracking with a father's anguish. Tears streamed down the girl's face. She tried to call back, to answer her father, but her voice was a hoarse whisper, too weak to carry across the yard. Caleb made a decision, a reckless, stupid decision that went against every instinct for survival. He laid his rifle and pistols on a hay bale, and he stepped out of the barn. He raised his empty hands high above his head. Instantly, 50 arrows were aimed at his chest. 50 bowstrings were drawn taut, ready to send death flying his way. The only sound was the wind in the creak of 50 leather saddles. "She's alive!" Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse. "Your daughter is alive, but she's hurt bad." The chief's expression didn't soften. If anything, the fury in his eyes burned even hotter. A white man claiming to have helped his daughter was an insult. It was a lie so profound, it was worse than an open threat. At least an enemy was honest about his hatred. "You lie," the chief spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Show her to us." And in that moment, Caleb realized his terrible, fatal mistake. If he brought Ayanna out, they would see the crude bandages, the blood-soaked hay, the way she could barely stand. To them, it wouldn't look like medical care. It would look like proof of torture. But if he refused, they would storm the barn. They would kill him, and in the chaos, they might accidentally kill her too. He was trapped. There was no right answer. But then a movement behind him made his blood freeze. Ayanna was on her feet. She was clutching her bandaged shoulder, her face pale and slick with sweat. But her eyes were burning with that same defiance he'd seen by the creek. She was going to face her father. She was going to say something that could either save them both or get them killed instantly. She stumbled out of the barn and into the harsh morning light. She faced her father, the war chief, and spoke 3 words in Comanche. Her voice was weak, but it carried across the yard with absolute clarity. The chief's face, which had been a mask of stone-cold rage, seemed to crumble. The war paint on his cheeks looked like it was draining of all its color. His powerful stallion reared back as if it had been struck. The 50 warriors shifted in their saddles, their bows lowering slightly. A wave of confusion rippled through the war party. Their mission of righteous vengeance had just been shattered by 3 simple words. "He saved me." But it wasn't over. Not even close. A younger warrior, his belt adorned with fresh scalps, rode up beside the chief. Caleb could see the rage and suspicion still burning in his eyes. He leaned in and whispered urgently to his leader, his hand gesturing angrily toward Caleb. The message was clear. "It's a trick. It's a white man's trap." Just then, Ayanna's strength gave out. She took 3 shaky steps toward her father's horse and then collapsed into the dust. The fever, the pain, the blood loss. It was all too much. Caleb lunged forward on instinct, wanting to catch her, to help her. But in a flash, 20 arrows were pointed back at his heart. "Do not touch her again," the chief warned, his voice a low growl. The doubt was creeping back into his eyes. 2 Comanche women quickly dismounted and rushed to Ayanna's side. They knelt, gently examining her bandages, feeling the fire on her forehead. They spoke in rapid, concerned tones. Caleb watched their faces, his heart pounding. He wasn't a doctor. He'd done his best, but what if he'd made it worse? What if they saw his work as butchery? Then the older of the 2 women looked up at the chief. She gave a single, slow nod. The work was good. The wound was clean. The white man had not lied. He had, against all odds, saved her life. But the young warrior with the scalps on his belt was not convinced. He urged his horse forward, stopping so close that Caleb could feel the animal's hot breath on his face. Up close, Caleb could see the warrior was maybe 25. A deep, ragged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and his eyes burned with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. "She is Chief's daughter," the warrior snarled in broken English. "You take her, you die. All white men die." And Caleb suddenly understood. This wasn't about Ayanna anymore. This wasn't about a kidnapping or a rescue. This young warrior, this lieutenant, wanted a war. He wanted an excuse to spill blood. And Caleb's act of mercy had just given him the perfect justification. The chief was still watching Caleb, his eyes narrowed, searching. He had seen 40 years of violence on this frontier, and he was trying to understand something that made no sense. "Why?" the chief asked, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "Why help enemy?" It was the same question Caleb had been asking himself. Why risk everything for one of them? The people who had taken Sarah from him. Why throw away his life for a complete stranger? Caleb looked from the suspicious chief to the hate-filled lieutenant, and then to Ayanna, lying fragile in the dirt. "Because she was dying," Caleb said. the words feeling truer than anything he had ever spoken. And I couldn't just stand there and watch. Something shifted in the chief's expression, a flicker of understanding, a father recognizing the basic humanity in another man. But the lieutenant was not moved. He spat on the ground. "Lies!" he roared. "White man lies. He keeps her for slave." The vile accusation hung in the air like poison. Caleb saw the doubt return to the chief's eyes. He saw the faces of the other warriors harden, their hands tightening on their weapons once more. The fragile peace was shattering. They were going to kill him after all. And that's when Ayanna spoke again. She pushed herself up on one elbow, and with a voice that was suddenly strong and clear, she called out in Comanche. Whatever she said, it made the lieutenant's face go ghost white under his war paint. Then she said something else, a longer sentence filled with fury and accusation, and it made her father, the great war chief, reach for the tomahawk at his belt. But he wasn't looking at Caleb. The truth exploded across the ranch yard like a cannon blast. Ayanna hadn't just been found by the army. She had been led into an ambush set up by the chief's own lieutenant. The young warrior with the scarred face was a traitor. He had been secretly feeding information to the cavalry, trading the locations of Comanche camps for army gold and promises of power. And Ayanna, hidden in the brush, had seen it all. She had witnessed his betrayal with her own eyes. "You speak lies, girl," the lieutenant screamed, but his voice was thin and reedy with panic. "The fever makes you crazy." But it was too late. 3 other warriors were already moving their horses, flanking him, cutting off his escape. Ayanna's words had been too specific, too detailed. She had named the place, the time, the name of the army captain he'd met with. Her father believed her, every single word. The chief's face had transformed. The anger he'd shown Caleb was nothing compared to this. This was a cold, silent, deadly rage. The kind of rage reserved for the deepest betrayal. But the lieutenant wasn't going to die easy. Desperate men do desperate things. He knew he would never survive Comanche justice for what he had done. His rifle, which had been resting across his lap, suddenly swung around. Not toward the chief, not toward Caleb. He aimed it directly at Ayanna, the only person who could truly condemn him. He was going to silence the only witness. Caleb didn't think. He didn't plan. He just moved. 3 years of pent-up grief, guilt, and rage exploded in a single violent motion. He launched himself forward, tackling the lieutenant clean off his horse. They hit the ground in a cloud of dust and fury. The ranch erupted into absolute chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted, confused. Some raised their weapons to shoot Caleb for attacking one of their own. Others moved to help him stop the traitor. Caleb felt a searing pain as the lieutenant's knife sliced across his ribs, but the adrenaline was like fire in his veins, numbing everything. He and the traitor rolled in the dirt, grappling for control of the rifle. This was the fight he had been waiting for since Sarah died. Not a fight against a people, but a fight against the kind of evil that poisons everything it touches. They rolled again, and the lieutenant came up on top, the knife now flashing toward Caleb's throat. The traitor's face was a mask of snarling desperation. "You should have minded your own business, white man," he hissed. Caleb bucked, throwing him off balance for just a second. It was all the time he needed. His hand closed around a heavy, smooth rock. He swung it once, hard. It connected with the lieutenant's temple with a sickening crunch. The knife fell from the traitor's hand. He collapsed, unconscious but still breathing. A trickle of blood seeping from his head wound into the thirsty Texas soil. A deafening silence fell over the ranch. 50 warriors stared, stunned, at the lone white man who had just saved their chief's daughter for a second time, this time from one of their own. The chief dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to where Caleb knelt, breathing heavily, the pain in his side starting to burn. For a long moment, the 2 men just looked at each other, a rancher and a war chief, 2 fathers who had lost too much, seen too much, but still knew honor when they saw it. "You fight," the chief said, the words a simple statement of fact, "to protect my daughter." "I do it again," Caleb replied, and he was surprised by how true the words were. The chief gave a single, sharp nod. He turned and spoke rapidly in Comanche to his warriors. Their expressions shifted from confusion to a dawning respect. But just as the tension seemed to be finally breaking, a new sound cut through the air. The sharp crack of a rifle shot from the ridge overlooking the ranch. Then another, and another. Caleb looked up and his heart sank. Lining the ridge were 20 cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the morning sky, and they were all aiming their rifles down into the ranch. Their commander was shouting an order, his voice carried on the wind. "Fire at will!" The lieutenant's betrayal ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. He hadn't just led Ayanna into an ambush. He had set this whole thing up. He knew the war party would track his daughter here. He knew they would surround the ranch. And he had told the army exactly when and where to find them. It was a perfectly laid trap. And Caleb's ranch was the bait. "Take cover!" Caleb yelled, but the Comanche were already moving. In the blink of an eye, they transformed from a stunned council into a disciplined fighting force. They dove from their horses, using the animals in Caleb's own buildings for cover as bullets rained down from the ridge. The chief grabbed Ayanna, dragging her behind a heavy wooden water trough, just as a volley of shots splintered the wood right where her head had been. She was too weak to run, trapped in the middle of a slaughter her own kinsmen had orchestrated. It all clicked into place in Caleb's mind with sickening clarity. The lieutenant's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. Frame the white rancher for kidnapping, draw the entire war party into the open, and then signal the cavalry for a surprise attack. He would have been a hero, the brave warrior who led the army to a decisive victory against his own people. He just hadn't counted on Ayanna surviving to expose him. A warrior near the barn cried out as a bullet tore through his shoulder. Another's horse screamed and collapsed, pinning its rider's leg. The cavalry had the high ground, the superior rifles, the element of surprise. But the Comanche had something more powerful. They had nothing left to lose. A voice bellowed from the ridge, cutting through the gunfire. "Thornfield, Caleb Thornfield, step away from the hostiles. We are here to rescue you." Rescue him? They were destroying his home. They were killing the very people he had just fought to protect. Caleb looked at the warriors around him. An hour ago, they were his mortal enemies. Now they were huddled behind his fence posts and his woodpile, their blood mixing with the dirt of his land. The chief caught his eye. He gave a sharp nod toward the cabin. "Go," the chief said, his voice grim. "This is not your war." He was giving Caleb a way out, an opportunity to save himself. But Caleb was already moving toward his cabin. Not to hide, not to surrender. He was going to get his rifle. The army thought they were here to rescue a helpless settler. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Caleb burst through his cabin door, grabbing his Winchester and every box of cartridges he owned. Through the window, he could see the battle raging. The Comanche were turning his ranch into a fortress, fighting with a ferocity that was pushing the soldiers back. When he emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, several of the warriors stared at him in disbelief. The chief's eyes widened as he saw Caleb take up a position behind the well, levering around into the chamber. "You choose to fight with us?" the chief asked, his voice filled with astonishment. Caleb took aim at a soldier on the ridge. "I choose to fight for what's right," he said. "What would you have done? Would you join the army that was supposed to be on your side, or defend the people who came to kill you, but ended up showing you honor?" Drop a comment below, because what Caleb did next was going to get a lot of people killed. His first shot dropped the cavalry sergeant who was leading a charge down the hill. And just like that, 20 U.S. Army rifles turned on the very man they'd come to rescue. Bullets ripped through the air around Caleb, shattering the windows of his cabin and chewing splinters from his porch railing. The irony was bitter. By choosing to stand with the Comanche, he had just declared war on his own people. But as he watched the chief bravely firing his own rifle to protect Ayanna, Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had made the right choice. This wasn't about race or allegiance anymore. It was about right and wrong. The Comanche were masters of this kind of fighting. They used every rock, every ditch, every piece of cover. They made every shot, every arrow count. Caleb's simple ranch was turned into a deadly maze for the soldiers charging down into the open. The cavalry commander, a young, ambitious captain named Patterson, was arrogant. He kept ordering foolish frontal assaults, sending his men to their deaths against the entrenched defenders. After the third failed charge, Caleb could see the remaining soldiers hesitating. Their morale was breaking. They were farm boys, not fanatics, and they were tired of following orders that were getting them killed. But the real danger wasn't on the ridge. It was in the dirt, just a few yards away. The traitorous lieutenant was stirring. His head was bleeding, but the rock hadn't killed him. He crawled, groaning, toward a rifle dropped by a fallen soldier. His eyes were fixed on the water trough where Ayanna was hiding. He was going to finish what he started, even if it was the last thing he did. Caleb saw the movement. He swung his Winchester around, but he was too far away, pinned down by fire from the ridge. He was never going to make the shot in time. The lieutenant's hand closed around the rifle. He started to lift it, a triumphant, bloody grin spreading across his face, and then an arrow appeared in his chest. It sprouted from his back with a soft thwump, the feathered shaft quivering. The lieutenant's eyes went wide with shock. He looked down at the arrowhead protruding from his ribs, then collapsed face first into the dirt, dead before he hit the ground. Caleb looked over to see one of the chief's own warriors lowering his bow, his face grim and set. The chief locked eyes with the warrior who had just killed his kinsman. He gave a single, solemn nod. Justice, brutal and swift, had been served in the middle of a firefight. The tide of the battle was turning. The cavalry had lost nearly half their men. Their ammunition was running low. But the Comanche were in a bad way too. They were almost out of arrows, and several of their warriors were badly wounded. Caleb was down to his last handful of cartridges when he heard it. A new sound. More horses, a lot of them, approaching from the east. His stomach dropped. It had to be cavalry reinforcements. It was over. They were all going to die. But as the riders came over the rise, Caleb saw they weren't wearing blue uniforms. They were ranchers. It was old Pete Murdoch from the spread 5 miles south, and the Jensen brothers, and nearly a dozen other men Caleb had known for years. They had been drawn by the sound of the sustained battle. They reined in their horses, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. They saw the dead soldiers. They saw the Comanche warriors fighting from cover. And they saw Caleb Thornfield, their neighbor, fighting right alongside them. Captain Patterson tried to take control of the situation. "Civilians, fall back," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a military operation against hostile Indians." But Pete Murdoch wasn't intimidated. He was a grizzled old rancher who had fought in 2 wars and feared nothing. He rode his horse right up to the line of soldiers, his own rifle held ready. "What in the hell are you doing, Patterson?" he bellowed. "That's Caleb Thornfield down there. And he ain't no Indian lover, but he don't shoot at folks without a damn good reason." Patterson's authority was gone. His mission was a disaster. His remaining men were looking at the armed ranchers, then back at him, their loyalty wavering. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Patterson's hand went for his sidearm. He was going to try and shoot his way out of this, to eliminate any witnesses to his catastrophic failure. The chief saw it happen the same instant Caleb did. Their eyes met across the dusty, blood-soaked yard. Patterson drew his pistol and aimed it squarely at Pete Murdoch. But before he could pull the trigger, the chief's tomahawk flew through the air in a silent, deadly arc. It buried itself in the captain's skull. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers, leaderless and surrounded, threw down their weapons. They had no quarrel with the ranchers, and they had just watched their commander get killed for trying to murder an unarmed man. Pete Murdoch dismounted and walked over to Caleb, his boots crunching on spent cartridges. Caleb was by the water trough, checking on Ayanna. The fighting, the shock, had somehow broken her fever. Her eyes were clear, though she was still terribly weak. "Caleb," Pete said, his voice quiet, "you want to tell me what in the Sam Hill is going on?" So Caleb told him. He told them everything. Finding Ayanna, removing the bullet, the arrival of her father, the lieutenant's shocking betrayal, and Patterson's reckless attack. The other ranchers gathered around, listening in stunned silence. The chief approached, his war paint smeared with sweat and gunpowder. He looked at the dead captain, at the surrendered soldiers, and at the ranchers who had ridden in to save them all. He pointed a bloody finger at Caleb. "This white man," the chief said, his voice ringing with authority, "has more honor than any soldier in a blue coat." Pete Murdoch nodded. "Caleb's always been good folk. If he says the girl needed help, then she needed help. End of story. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was a mess. There were nearly a dozen dead U.S. soldiers on Caleb's property. A captain had been killed by a Comanche war chief, and a band of warriors was now standing side by side with a group of white ranchers. This was the kind of incident that didn't just start skirmishes. It started full-blown wars. The chief understood this. He barked orders to his men. They began gathering their wounded, preparing to leave. It was better to retreat and disappear than to wait for the entire U.S. Army to descend on them for revenge. Wait, Caleb said. He looked at Ayanna. She was trying to stand, but she was still too weak. She's not ready to travel. That wound could open up again. The chief's jaw tightened. He was torn between the safety of his people and the life of his daughter. We take that risk, he said grimly, but Ayanna had her own opinion. She pushed herself to her feet, leaning against the trough for support. She spoke in Comanche, her voice weak but firm, filled with the authority of a chief's daughter. Her father's eyes widened in shock at what she said. She was refusing to leave. She was invoking an ancient Comanche law, claiming sanctuary. She was placing herself under Caleb Thornfield's protection until she was healed. It was a gesture of ultimate trust, a bond that could not be broken. The chief looked at Caleb, a complex mixture of respect and deep worry on his face. She chooses to trust you with her life, he said. He didn't need to finish the sentence. If she dies here, we will burn this entire valley to the ground. He unhooked the beaded medicine bag from his own belt, a sacred object, and held it out to Caleb. My daughter says you lost a wife to our people. This cannot bring her back, but it is a promise. My band will never again harm you or your land. As Caleb reached for the bag, a new sound filled the air, the thunder of hundreds of hooves, and the call of a cavalry bugle. From 3 different directions, company after company of blue-coated soldiers were converging on the ranch, but this time they were led by an officer flying a white flag of truce. The new arrival was Colonel Hayes from Fort Griffin. He was an older man, a veteran of the Civil War, with eyes that had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. He wasn't like Patterson. He was a man who preferred peace to war, but was brutally effective at the latter when necessary. When he took in the scene, the dead soldiers, the Comanche warriors, and the local ranchers all standing together in a tense, unbelievable alliance, he knew that this was no simple Indian raid. Captain Patterson was ordered to investigate a kidnapping report, Hayes said, his voice calm and steady, not to start a war on a civilian's property. Pete Murdoch spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Your boy Patterson was about to shoot me in the face for asking a question, Colonel. If the chief hadn't stopped him, you'd be burying ranchers too. Colonel Hayes dismounted, his experienced gaze sweeping over everything. He saw Ayanna and her neatly bandaged wound. He saw the dead traitor with an arrow in his chest. He saw the sacred medicine bag that the chief had given Caleb. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a rescue that had spiraled into a political nightmare. Hayes knew how to navigate these nightmares. It was how he'd survived 30 years on the frontier. He needed a story that everyone could live with. He looked at the chief. It appears there has been a terrible misunderstanding. The Army received faulty intelligence. The chief, a shrewd negotiator himself, nodded slowly. The white man saved my daughter. We came to honor him. Your soldiers fired without cause. And yet several of my men are dead, Hayes countered. Because they attacked during a peaceful talk, the chief replied. It was a standoff, but one of words, not weapons. Both men were looking for a way out. I propose this, Hayes said finally, his voice carrying across the silent yard. My official report will state that Captain Patterson tragically exceeded his authority and was killed when he fired upon a peaceful negotiation. The Army will offer its apologies. The Comanche will return to their territory, and Mr. Thornfield will be left in peace. It was a lie, a neat, tidy lie that would prevent a war. It painted Patterson as a rogue officer, honored the dead soldiers as victims of his poor judgment, and allowed the chief to leave with his honor intact. Everyone agreed, but there was one problem. Ayanna still refused to leave. For 2 weeks, she stayed at Caleb's ranch, a guest protected by an unspoken truce between the Comanche and the U.S. Army. During that time, a strange and quiet friendship began to form. She taught him words in her language. He taught her how to read English from an old Bible. They didn't talk about the violence. They talked about their lives, their families, their hopes for a future that wasn't soaked in blood. When the time came for her to leave, she was strong and healthy. As she rode away back to her people, she turned and looked at Caleb. It wasn't just gratitude in her eyes, it was the look of a true friend. Caleb Thornfield's life was never the same. The chief kept his promise. No Comanche ever raided his land again. In fact, his ranch became a kind of neutral territory, a place where settlers and natives could meet to trade, to talk, to settle disputes without violence. Caleb became a bridge between two worlds. Years later, Ayana, using the English that Caleb had taught her, became a powerful voice for her people. A skilled negotiator who fought for their rights with words and treaties instead of arrows and guns. Caleb never remarried, but his heart was no longer consumed by hatred. He had found a different kind of family, a different kind of peace. When he died of old age 30 years later, the medicine bag was still on his belt, and at his funeral, white ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with Comanche warriors, mourning the passing of a man who had proved that sometimes the hardest choice is the only one that can save everyone. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the stories I have coming up are even more unbelievable than this one. And click the video on your screen now for a story with a twist so shocking you'll be thinking about it for weeks.